In an interview with the BBC you gave a couple of years ago, the journalist asked you about how you squared your pessimism with your optimism, and I believe you remain optimistic about social change and all that it can bring. But do you remain optimistic now, all these years later? And if so, why? Can you give some examples so that it alleviates some of my pessimism about society?
Well, you know, there's a famous line of Gramsci's, but wasn't original to him, but he made it famous. We should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I think that's a good formula. With regard to pessimism, we have two choices. We can say, look, everything's hopeless, so let's quit, and we'll help ensure that the worst will happen. Or we'll say, look, there are possibilities, let's pursue them, maybe things will get a little better. But that's not a real choice. And that's all there is to say. I mean, for every one of these major problems, there are possible solutions. And there's, in many respects, our societies are considerably more civilized than they were, say, 50 years ago. Many respects. So, for example, the most striking example is women's rights. That's just changed enormously in the last 50 or 60 years in much of the world, in the West in particular. All sorts of cases. I mean, take the United States. In the United States, women, go back to the early days of American history, the founding fathers took over British common law, of course. Under British common law, women were not persons, they were property. A woman was the property of her father, transmitted to her husband. Over the years, that changed, but slowly. It wasn't until 1975 in the United States that women had a legal, guaranteed right to serve as peers in federal juries. Peers means equal persons. That's just a few years ago. That's one of many changes. It takes an opposition to aggression. It's much higher than it was back in the early 60s. What I described in the early 60s, it could not take place now. So you compare, say, the invasion of Vietnam with the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was the first time in the history of Western imperialism when you had huge protests before the invasion was officially declared. I mean, it had been going on, but before it was officially declared, there were huge protests. That's totally different from what happened in the invasion of South Vietnam, okay? And it had an effect. I mean, what happened in Iraq was bad enough, but Bush and Blair never dreamed of carrying out the kinds of actions that Kennedy and Johnson carried out with impunity. All right, those are changes. Take nuclear weapons. There now is very widespread popular opposition to development of nuclear weapons. It's still going on, and the threat of nuclear war, I think, is severe, much more than people imagine. But it's been lessened, and there's popular opposition which could grow. In the case of the major issue we face, environmental catastrophe, that was not even considered a problem 40 years ago. And now it's understood to be a problem, and there's plenty of popular activism, even not enough, but plenty doing something about it. These and many other things are signs of, there are other signs for reasons for optimism. It takes Latin America. Okay, for 500 years since the conquistadors, Latin America was dominated by foreign powers. The last century or so, the United States. And internally, virtually every Latin American country was run by a small, wealthy, Europeanized, often white elite in the midst of enormous poverty and suffering in basically potentially pretty rich societies. The last 10 or 15 years, that's changed. There's a reason why Assange is in the Ecuadorian embassy. Latin America has become significantly free of external control, more so than almost any other part of the world. and it's beginning to face some of its horrible internal problems. Now, those are all signs of optimism. It means there are things that can be done.